Hey guys, welcome to this Y'all Politics broadcast. I'm Frank Corder with Y'all Politics. Joining me now is our Governor, Tate Reeves. Governor Reeves, thanks for your time, sir.
It's great to be on with you today, Frank.
So it's a lot of conversations going along right now because the gavel hits tomorrow in the state capitol. But before we get to that, we have a rising number of COVID cases and also hospitalizations. Kind of tell us where we are right now with COVID in our state and what you are seeing as far as our statewide response.
Well, we're clearly the new variant that has taken over not only across Mississippi, not only across the United States, but really across the globe is a variant of the COVID-19 that is highly contagious. It appears from South Africa, now in England and other countries in Europe, that not only is it highly contagious, but it is not quite as severe in terms of the symptoms, and there is speculation that it's having less effect on individuals' lungs, et cetera. But because it is so highly contagious, we are seeing rapid increases in the numbers. Just a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2.5 weeks ago, our 7-day average number of cases, Frank, was about 200 cases per day. That's at least 5 times that amount. And although the numbers haven't yet come out for the weekend, I anticipate they're going to be very, very high as we've seen significant uptick in not only the number of people who are getting tested, but also test positivity rates. And so I expect the numbers will be very high coming off the weekend. We've also seen an uptick in the total number of hospitalizations. We were down below 200 for quite a few weeks in a row, maybe even several months in a row. Late last week, that number had risen to about 550 hospitalizations due to COVID, or at least hospitalizations of individuals with COVID. And I expect that number to continue to rise. If you look at what's happening around the country, there is expectations that this particular surge may peak nationally as early next week. But I think we're going to go through the next couple or 3 weeks of some real challenges, and it's why we've been encouraging everyone to recognize that we're not going to have mandates. We're not going to shut down businesses in Mississippi. We're not going to force Mississippians to do anything, but we're going to encourage you to recognize that there are things out there, such as the potential for vaccinations and other things that can help you protect yourself. We've had almost 1.7 million Mississippians now that have gotten at least one shot. We've gotten almost 1.5 million Mississippians that have been double vaccinated. And so we encourage particularly those individuals that have gotten the first shot but hadn't gotten the second one yet to please do so, to consider doing so. But also if you're older, more vulnerable, because let's be honest, this particular strain of the virus is certainly much more it's just like the previous ones, in which those individuals that are heavier, that are more obese, that have diabetes, that have more comorbidities, are at a much higher risk than those who are not. And so if you fit into those categories, we encourage you to get talk to your doctor and get a booster shot as well. So again, I think we're going to have a couple of tough weeks, but most Mississippians are aware of it. They recognize what can be done, and if you choose, you also can do other things like reducing the number of large crowds indoor that you're in, and things such as that. If that's the risk level that you are comfortable with.
Last week, we reported on the lagging monoclonal antibody treatments following a distribution pause from the Biden administration. Is our state getting what we need from the federal government from a public health perspective in terms of tests, therapeutics, and even financial aid?
Well, the money isn't the issue. This particular federal government under the Biden administration and this Congress has basically spent billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars and made those available. However, I found it quite ironic last week when the president said that there is no national solution, that we're going to leave everything up to the states. Well, we appreciate that, except for the fact that the federal government under the Biden administration controls the distribution of tests. They control the distribution of monoclonal antibodies. And there's no doubt that states like Mississippi and others, I saw Governor Abbott complaining about this over the weekend. the reality is, while in other parts of the country, such as the Northeast, not only is the dominant strain the Omicron, but perhaps the only strain that is available or that is going around up there is that particular variant. And the old monoclonal antibodies, the Regeneron, evidently doesn't have as good of a positive effect with that. But in places like Mississippi, where somewhere, at least in the middle part of last week, we believed that somewhere between a quarter to a third of all new cases was still the Delta variant, those monoclonal antibodies played a significant role in us saving thousands and thousands of lives. And yes, the Biden administration made the decision to not distribute those dating back weeks ago. As you probably remember, as early as September, they started cutting our allocation here in the South and spreading them to other places. But that has continued as recently as last week. And so we're having a hard time. We don't have, I'm hearing from physicians and others that they don't have the Regeneron, as much Regeneron as they like. And it's a direct result of reduced allocations from the federal government because they have decided to take over those allocations.
Your thoughts ahead of the Supreme Court's consideration of the president's COVID vaccine mandates?
Well, we clearly believe that those federal mandates signed by one individual in the White House are unconstitutional. We have fought this from the beginning. Mississippi has filed lawsuits in all four instances in which the president has tried to institute mandates. And in all four cases, we've had a stay of some sort. And so Mississippi has won. What I would tell you is I'm not a lawyer, Frank, and some people say I ain't really that smart either. But what I have watched is the action taken by the U.S. Supreme Court is really unprecedented to take all four of these cases and put them all together. For them to come in a week earlier than they had originally anticipated coming in to hear these cases and to hear the oral arguments on Friday certainly gives me reason for optimism. I think that we could clearly the OSHA mandate is scheduled to take effect as early as next Monday, January the 10th. And so with the case being heard on Friday, it gives the 9 justices of the court the ability over the weekend to render a stay, hopefully in all 4 of those cases, pending the ultimate outcome of the results. And that's seems to me to be certainly a possible scenario and one that we would welcome.
So let's move on to tomorrow when the lawmakers gavel back in for the 2022 session. There are a variety of hot topics that these legislators will be considering in hopes of getting to your desk one day. Let's start with income tax. Most conservatives agree that it should be phased out, but the question is how. You've outlined your plan, and the House leadership appears to be set on theirs. You know the process and the players. What can be done to get this through this session?
Well, Frank, we've had a lot of very positive discussions over the last 6 months with those in the Senate that did not take up the House bill last year, but also with those leaders that were leading the charge in the House of Representatives as well. And the point that you made that I think is really important is there's general agreement that we recognize as leaders, as conservatives, as Republicans, as Mississippians, that the income tax puts us at a competitive disadvantage when trying to bring better and higher paying jobs to our state. Whether we like it or not, you don't have to be a genius to look at a map and recognize with Texas to our west and Florida to our east and Tennessee to our north, all 3 of which have no income tax, that we're at a bit of a competitive disadvantage. And so I think there's a lot of desire to get this done. And so I'm optimistic. I'm an eternal optimist, particularly the day before the legislative session begins. But I'm optimistic that we're gonna see real progress towards this goal this year. Again, I mean, there's details that have to be worked out. There always are details that have to be worked out. But this is a major, big picture item. And let me just remind everyone that the reason we can have this conversation about eliminating the income tax is because of the conservative fiscal policies that we've been put in place for the last 10 years. Sure. When the Republicans took over the House and when I got elected lieutenant governor, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 33 to 34,000 state employees. We have closer to 25,000 state employees today. We've done the things to lay the groundwork, which is the reason in the fiscal year that ended June 30th, we collected over $1 billion in revenue more over and above what was projected and over and above what was spent. It's the reason that in the first 6 months of this fiscal year that we're over $500 million already to the good. So it's this excess revenue that's coming in that allows us to have this conversation. It's the reason I say we can eliminate it without raising other taxes. But we'll see where those conversations and discussions go in the coming weeks.
If you follow social media, medical marijuana and Medicaid expansion are the two most talked about talking points. Let's start with medical marijuana. Last week, you said the question was whether the state wants a medical or a recreational program, and you appeared to be willing to negotiate the amount that a patient could get at any one time. Yet many lawmakers are saying the votes are there to keep the bill in its current form in those amounts, even saying that they could override a veto perhaps. How are those talks going from your perspective, and would you consider a veto if that amount isn't lowered?
Well, obviously, that is the way the process works. The reality is that, you know, and to me it's a bit of a mistake to start this conversation by saying medical marijuana. Let's start with marijuana and then let's define what is medical and what is not. Here's the bill as it currently exists, and this is the reason the limits on the amount of marijuana that any one individual can get in any one day is so important. The bill as it currently exists is going to allow for these little green buildings to pop up in every small town all throughout Mississippi. Inside these little green buildings are going to be where the dispensary is, where they are dispensing marijuana. And so inside that dispensary, which for every other medicine is done by a pharmacist, in these dispensaries, there's going to be what the legislature calls a bud master doing the dispensing. This bud master is going to be required to have 8 hours, not 8 days, not 8 weeks, not 8 months, but 8 hours of training to do this dispensing. And so if the number of individuals that get the marijuana card, so what's going to happen is an individual is going to go to a doctor, not necessarily their doctor, but to a doctor, and get a medical marijuana card. That medical marijuana card is valid for an entire year. And so with the current limits that are in the bill, that individual could go to that dispensary, that bud tender who has 8 hours of training can then give that individual enough marijuana for that individual to smoke 11 joints a day every single day for 365 days of the year. Well, if you take the 3 million Mississippians we have and you extrapolate Oklahoma's the number of people in Oklahoma that have a medical marijuana card, that means there will be 300,000 Mississippians, about 10% of our population, that will have a marijuana card. 300,000 at 11 joints a day means there'll be about 3.3 million joints a day on the streets of Mississippi, almost 100 million joints in a month, over 1.2 billion in a year. And so for me, that surpasses what's typically considered medical. When I travel around Mississippi, and particularly when I talk to Republicans, there's an overwhelming majority of people in our state that are for medical marijuana. But there's also an overwhelming majority that believe there ought to be reasonable restrictions and limitations in place to ensure that it is truly medical and that it's not recreational. And so while I wouldn't have set up that system where there's a dispensary on every corner, nor would I have set up a system in which there were bud masters doing the distribution. Of course, some of that is necessary because, oh, by the way, medical marijuana or marijuana in general is still illegal at the federal level. So I wouldn't necessarily set up that system, but I'm willing to go along with that system that the legislature sets up as long as there are reasonable limits on how much medical marijuana can get in any one person's hands. And so all of this talk about vetoes and overriding vetoes, I'm an optimist, and so I'm hopeful that there are enough members in the legislature that on the front end will recognize these challenges and say, look, hey, let's take a step back. Let's start with a lower amount. If it becomes necessary a year from now, the legislature comes in every year, a year from now or 2 years from now, that we just have to get more marijuana on the streets. It could always be raised at some point in the future. And I'm hopeful that that's the direction they go.
You remain opposed to Medicaid expansion, and should lawmakers attempt that, I would assume you would strongly consider a veto for that as well. But there may be attempts to expand Medicaid this session nonetheless, even from some on the right side of the aisle. In your mind, why does this issue remain such a hot topic for the left and these hospital executives?
Well, the Obamacare expansion, in my view, was on the ballot in Mississippi in 2019. I was very adamant in my opposition to Obamacare expansion. You'll remember that I had two Republican primary opponents that both supported it. They both lost. I had a Democrat that supported it. He lost. And so the fact is that there are going to be those that continue to talk about it. I would argue there are not very many of them on the right side of the aisle. They may run as Republicans, but I wouldn't say they're on the right side of the aisle. And so the fact is that there are those in the industries that want us to do certain things, but I don't believe that Obamacare expansion is the best thing for Mississippi, nor the best thing for the long-term health of our state.
How would you like to see lawmakers tackle the initiative process reform? Should there be a way to enact state law without amending the Constitution, and should there be a higher threshold to amend the state constitution?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. First of all, I support access to the ballot. I believe that individuals ought to be able to go to the ballot and express their opinions. But I also believe that it ought to be hard to get it done. And it shouldn't be an easy thing. The problem with the ballot initiative that was recently struck down by the Supreme Court is that if one individual had $2 or $3 million on a particular topic, they could come in and basically buy an election to change our Constitution, and it could never be changed in the future. And so I think the legislature ought to strongly consider giving access to the ballot, but to do so in a way in which statutes are changed rather than the Constitution is changed. Because there are very few people, for instance, even most of the most strongly adamant marijuana supporters will tell you that, hey, they really want marijuana in our state, but they don't necessarily want it in our state constitution, particularly now that it continues to be illegal at the federal level. So we're going to put something in our state constitution that is against federal law. I'm a pretty strong proponent of states' rights, but even that seems a little bit odd to me and to most people. And so I think certainly we ought to give access to the ballot. We should give real consideration to it being statutory changes rather than constitutional changes. And then I also think we ought to review exactly how many signatures it takes and where those signatures need to be gathered from.
On Friday, we did a story on a proposed change to the social studies curriculum by the State Department of Education. That new curriculum was largely formed using resources and the assistance from a group that has advocated for critical race theory and other strong liberal ideologies. You said that you would sign a bill that restricts CRT in our classrooms. Some say CRT isn't in Mississippi, but yet social emotional learning models and this CRT-like curriculum are moving in. What can be done for those who are concerned about this, and what are you willing to do to push back against it?
Well, Frank, this is a great time, I think, to just be very clear about a couple of things. Most of the issues that seem to be at the forefront of conversations, and I guess this is because this is what the mainstream media wants, but you talked about Obamacare expansion, for instance. You talk about marijuana. I mean, these are by and large issues that are being driven not by Republicans, but that are being driven by Democrats. Here's an issue, the elimination of critical race theory, that we as conservatives who, oh, by the way, control 2/3 of the House, control 2/3 of the Senate, these are the issues that we ought to be talking about in our state. We ought to be talking about passing laws to eliminate mandates and to ensure that we don't have mandates in the state of Mississippi. We ought to be talking about eliminating critical race theory. We ought to be highlighting the fact that the conservative reforms that we made in education 10 years ago are working. I don't know if you saw the article in the recent Economist, but in that article, it points out that about 8 or 10 years ago, if you looked at fourth grade reading results, Mississippi was 49th. And that's what the Democrats love to talk about. The far left loves to talk about Mississippi's last in education. But our fourth grade reading results in the most recent data were 29th. And in 2019, we were the only state in the nation that actually saw improvement year over year. And so my point in mentioning that is conservative reforms work. Conservative reforms work in all of government, but particularly in education. And oh, by the way, I would just point out that because these conservative reforms that we enacted against the many in the establishment who fought us, but the conservative reforms work, and they work because our teachers in Mississippi, by and large, are doing the work. And I believe as a conservative, and I believe we as a state should reward those teachers. And so I think we ought to pass legislation early in the session to ensure through statute that we ban CRT in our schools, but I also think we ought to pass legislation early on to reward our teachers with a significant pay raise. One that I have proposed, and we were able to get $1,000 across the board last year. That's positive movement. We need more. We need more. We need to reward our teachers because our students' achievement are improving. They're improving because we have high-quality teachers in the classroom, and they're improving also because we dared to go against the establishment and actually fight for conservative reforms, and we ought to continue to focus on that.
So $1.8 billion in American Rescue Plan funds has come to the state or is in the process of coming to the state. Hospitals want funding to help retain healthcare workers. Lawmakers are talking about infrastructure needs. Education folks are pushing for even more money. And there's other interest out there as well. In your opinion, what's the highest and best use to focus on spending this fund now?
Yeah, well, let me just remind everyone also, there's $1.8 billion in ARPA funding. But there's also over $2 billion in excess state revenues that have been collected last year and will have been collected by the end of June that also is available. And so, look, I was around when that wasn't the case, when there wasn't $4 billion in additional monies. The first thing we ought to do with that money is recognize that we have it and give the taxpayers a pay raise. We ought to give them back some of their money. Let you keep more of your money because you know better how to spend your money than any governmental entity ever will. So the first thing we ought to do is recognize that this came through a growing economy, and we ought to cut taxes and return these monies at the state level back to the individuals. In addition to that, we ought to invest in our people. Workforce development and workforce training. We've proposed a $130 million investment in Accelerate Mississippi because we've got to train and retrain today's Mississippi workforce for the jobs of the next 50 years, not the jobs of the last 50 years. We ought to take our state money, that $2 billion that I mentioned, we ought to give a teacher pay raise, a significant teacher pay raise, because they're making a huge difference. And the best thing we can do long-term is have a more educated workforce because that's going to lead to better and higher paying jobs in our state. We also have a number of other opportunities. The thing that I'd tell you, Frank, is, and I've had many conversations with him about this, I want to commend Lieutenant Governor Hosemann. When he said recently that he doesn't want to spend these federal dollars on things that'll help for the next 1 or 2 years, but on things that'll help for the next 1 or 2 generations. I commend him for saying that. He is exactly right, and I love where his mind's at with respect to that. And and some of the specifics that he mentioned is, for instance, a grant program that matches the federal level, because we want to encourage and incentivize our cities and counties who, oh, by the way, got $900 million of their own money. We want to encourage them to spend their money on long-term infrastructure needs as well. and we can utilize some of our federal money to match what the cities and counties are doing. So that way we incentivize them to spend it in the right way, and we also get more bang for our buck. And so those things like water and sewer systems that need to be fixed, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity for us to utilize these federal resources, take our state dollars as well, and match so that we make real meaningful change. What we can't allow to happen, Frank, and I'll take where I'm sitting right now as an example. The city of Jackson and Hinds County got somewhere between $90 and $95 million just to themselves. Now, they're very quick to ask the state to help with the water and sewer system in Jackson, and I'm willing to do that. But they've got to show that they're going to take their $90 to $95 million and invest it in their water and sewer system. And then after they do that, then we should talk about what the state's investment's going to be. It's something that we need to do. I am very interested in making sure that we continue to make investments here in downtown Jackson. I think it's important that we have a viable capital city. But to have a viable capital city, we also have to have we got to have more law enforcement. And that's why I proposed doubling the size of the Capitol Police Force. We need the city to ensure that they have leaders that support Jackson Police Department, support their leadership, and support those men and women who are in uniform. Because by and large, the individual officers at JPD do a good job. There's just not enough of them, and I hope that the city will invest in that as well.
Governor Reeves, thanks for your time today. We appreciate you sitting down with us and to discuss these hot topics. As the session progresses, we'll get you back on for more updates.
I look forward to it, Frank. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for watching us here on Y'all Politics and y'allpolitics.com and across all of our social media platforms. And we'll see you next time.